right, so good morning or good afternoon, guys. This is Mr. Guayaso. As y'all can see, today we are talking about writing system of equations, day 2. So yesterday you were introduced to writing systems of equation from Ms. Alderman. Today we're going to take things a little step further and look at a few more examples. So as y'all can see in the directions, what we're going to be doing is writing a system of equation for each scenario. We're going to label the two variables in each scenario, and we're going to write two equations. So, in this first example, example 1, our scenario is your teacher is giving you a test worth 100 points. The test has 30 questions. There are 3-point questions and 4-point questions on the test. We want to know how many of each type of question are on the test, okay? So, first things first, let's go through and underline what our variables are. So if we look, this one's kind of a tough one, but the variables are actually that there's 3-point questions and 4-point questions, right? Those are the two things that we're trying to figure out, how many of each type of question there are on the test, okay? Another thing that we're gonna do in this scenario is we're gonna label some totals that we see, okay? So if we look here, right, I have a number, 100 points. That is going to be a total, right? Because that's the total number of points on the test, 100. And then I have another one, right? The 30. That is the total number of questions, okay? So we're going to use those numbers eventually once we get to our equation, okay? So first, let's label our variables. Our first variable, we're going to call that x. And the x is going to be 3-point questions. Okay, and y, we're going to label those 4-point questions. And y'all can use really any variable you want. You can use z, a, b, c, whatever you want, but x and y are usually kind of the go-to. They're the easiest ones, okay? Now, once we have those variables, we can write our equations, okay? So we're going to use our totals to come up with our equations, okay? So, Let's write one for the number of questions first, okay? So, this total says I have 30 questions, okay? So I know the types of questions I have are 3-point questions and 4-point questions, okay? So I want to write this first equation, and I'll explain how we got to it. So this is going to be our first one. X plus y equals 30, okay? Now, looking back at what this means, what I just said here in a math equation is I said the number of 3-point questions plus the number of 4-point questions adds up to 30 total questions, okay? Because if you look in this right here, nothing I said was the number of points, right? All we're talking about is the actual number of questions, okay? In our second equation, here we're going to get into the points, okay? So watch what I'm going to do here in the second equation. So we're going to start this second one because we know there's 100 total points, right? So I'm going to say 3x, okay? And the reason I said that is because each of the 3-point questions is worth 3 points. So 3x plus, right, y is the 4-point question. So plus 4y equals the total number of points, which is 100, okay? So if we read these two equations, right, if we read them as like sentences, the first one says, right, the number of 3-point questions plus the number of 4-point questions equals 30 total questions. This second mathematical equation says 3 times the number of 3-point questions plus 4 times the number of 4-point questions equals 100 points. Okay, so these two equations we're going to use to answer this question. How many of each type of question are on the test? Okay, but we'll get to that next week. But these are the two equations that we use to make a system to help us solve the equation, or to help us figure out the question. Okay, so that's example 1. Hopefully a few more will kind of help this make a little more sense. Example 2, so we're going to do the same steps. So example 2 says, Megan has a coin purse that only has nickels and dimes in it. There are 28 coins with a value of $2.25. how many of each type of coin does Megan have? Okay, so again, we're gonna start by underlining our variables. This one should be a little easier to identify. Our two variables are nickels and dimes, okay? So you're gonna see a lot of money examples, like you're gonna see a lot of nickels, dimes, quarters, not too many pennies, but usually your coins, the type of coin are gonna be the variable. So we can go ahead and fill those out already. So nickel, I spelled that wrong. Nickel, that can be my X. Dimes, that can be my Y's, okay? So we got our variables. Now we're gonna go and label some totals. So the 28 coins, that tells me the total number of coins, okay? And then the $2.25, well, that's a money total. That tells me the total amount of money that I have, or that Megan has in her purse, okay? So let's start writing some equations. So again, let's start with the coin total, okay? So I know that there's 28 total coins, right? And I know the only two types are nickels and dimes. So if I start it out, I can say X, which is the number of nickels. So the number of nickels plus Y, which is the number of dimes, equals 28 coins, right? The total number of coins, okay? So that's what that sentence, or that's what that equation means, okay? Now, the next one, the next equation I'm gonna write is gonna be a money total. So I need money attached to my variables, okay? So it's gonna be a little weird. So nickels, right? Nickels are worth 5 cents, but we cannot put 5x, okay? That doesn't really make sense because that would be like $5. So to say 5 cents, we're gonna write it like this, 0.05, right? Because that says 5 cents. Like if we put a money sign in front of it, that would mean 5 cents. So 0.05x, because that's how much nickels, that's nickels, plus 0.10, right, because that's 10 cents, that's for dimes, equals $2.25, okay? So 5 cents for every nickel plus 10 cents for every dime equals $2.25. So now these two equations we could use to help us solve the question, how many of each type of coin does Megan have, okay? So again, those two equations there. Number 3. Okay, so example 3, we have on vacation, Charlie and Gail took turns driving. Together they drove 325 miles. The distance that Charlie drove was 115 miles more than the distance Gail drove. How far did each of them drive? Okay, so again, let's find our variables. This one is a little weird, but hopefully as y'all do more examples, you'll kind of get the swing of things on how to find the variables. So this one, the first variables are actually the distance that Charlie drove. That's one variable, which means the other variable is the distance Gail drove. Okay, so we can put our X, put our Y. So the distance Charlie drove can be X, and the distance Gail drove can be Y. Okay, now it's kind of funky, but as y'all, again, like I said, as y'all do more examples, you should get the hang of it. Now we look for totals, okay? So I see the 325 here, and it says together they drove 325 miles. So that is the total number of miles, right? I also see this number 115, but if I read it, it says the distance that Charlie drove was 115 miles more than the distance Gail drove. So this isn't exactly a total. It's just comparing the two distances, okay? So we only have one total for this scenario, okay? So, but we're still gonna use that total to write one of our equations, okay? So I know that X is the distance Charlie drove, right? So X, the distance Charlie drove, plus the distance Gail drove. So if I combine both together, that says together they drove 325 miles. So I use that first total to get my first equation, okay? Now, the second equation, I am gonna use this 115, but it's gonna be a little different, okay? So I'm gonna start by writing X here. So right now this says the distance that Charlie drove. So I'm gonna try to replicate this sentence into a mathematical equation. So the distance Charlie drove was 115 miles more than the distance Gail drove. Okay, so watch how I'm gonna say that using math. So I'm gonna say equals y plus 115. Okay, so let's think about this. So right here, what I'm saying is the distance Charlie drove is the same as the distance Gail drove plus 115, okay? And that makes sense because the distance Charlie drove was 115 miles more than the distance Gail drove. So we took Gail's distance, added 115, that gives us Charlie's, okay? So what we did is we wrote this sentence as a mathematical equation, okay? Again, it is a little tricky. I know it's kind of tough to understand, but hopefully as y'all see some more examples and y'all practice, y'all will understand how to do this, okay? And then like I said, eventually we're gonna move forward to actually solving the systems that we create, but that's in a couple days, maybe next week, okay? So if y'all have any questions, feel free to ask your teacher, and that's about it. So y'all have a great day. I'll see y'all in Zoom.